The phone was still in his vest pocket when he left the cemetery. He had not looked at it since Thursday. 4 days of carrying it without unlocking it, without scrolling, without doing the thing that everyone else did with their phones, when silence became too heavy to hold. He had watched other men in the chapter pull theirs out during the reception, at the roadhouse, filling the spaces between condolences with the small mechanical comfort of screens. Dax Harlow had left his in his pocket and stood near the back wall with a glass of water he did not drink, and watched the room move through its grief in the way that rooms did. Now it was Sunday night and he was on the bike and the phone was still in his pocket, and the storm had been building since he crossed the county line. State Route 67 ran due west out of Black Ridge and then bent south through 40 miles of high desert before it reached anything that could be called a town. Dax knew this stretch of road the way he knew the back of his own hand, which was to say he knew it in the dark, in bad weather, in conditions that discouraged most people from being on it at all. He had ridden it for 23 years. He knew where the pavement got rough near mile marker 190. He knew where the shoulder dropped away without warning past the old Kessler Ranch. He knew every bend and every grade and every place where the wind came off the mesa, at an angle that would push a motorcycle sideways if you were not ready for it. He was always ready for it. What he was not ready for, what he had not been ready for in 4 days, was the quality of silence inside his own head. Cutter Marsh had been dead for 72 hours by the time Dax stood at the graveside. The accident had happened on a Wednesday evening on a road about 30 miles east of where Dax was riding now, a 2-lane county road that cut through a dry wash between 2 ridgelines. The weather had been similar to tonight, rain and wind and the kind of darkness that came down fast in the desert when the clouds were thick. Cutter had been riding home from a parts run solo, the way he sometimes did when he was in the mood to think. His motorcycle had gone off the shoulder on a curve down a 6-foot embankment and into the wash below. Nobody had found him for 2 hours. 2 hours on a road that people drove on a night that was dark and wet, but not impassable. And nobody had stopped. Nobody had seen the skid marks in the gravel. Nobody had noticed the gap in the guardrail, which was old and bent anyway and easy to miss. By the time a man in a pickup truck happened to angle his headlights the right way and see the chrome glinting at the bottom of the wash, it was too late for Cutter to be anything other than what he had become. Dax had been in his garage when it happened. He had been rechecking the torque on a cylinder head he had already checked twice that afternoon, the kind of repetitive mechanical work he did when his mind was restless, when the chapter business that week had left him with an unsettled feeling he could not pin down. His phone had been on the workbench. It had lit up at 9:47 with a message from Cutter, and Dax had been elbow deep in the engine and had thought not now, and had kept working. He had not looked at the message until 11:15 when his phone rang with a different number, and a voice he did not recognize told him to come to Desert Valley Medical Center. The message was still there. He had read it 17 times in 4 days, which was not something he would have admitted to anyone. Each time he read it, the message was the same. 6 words. Heading home. Road's bad tonight. That was all. No question, no request, no indication that anything was wrong. Just Cutter telling him what Cutter always told him when he was heading back from somewhere. The kind of message that existed in the texture of a friendship built over 19 years. The kind of thing you sent not because it was necessary, but because you were in the habit of keeping someone informed about where you were. Dax had not responded. If he had responded, nothing would have changed. He understood this. The rational accounting of the situation was clear, and he had done it many times in 4 days. Cutter's accident had already happened when Dax finally read the message. There was nothing a response could have done. The timeline was not kind to guilt, and it was not kind to what if, and Dax Harlow was not a man who indulged in either. He was, however, a man who had not been able to sleep in 4 nights, which was why he was on State Route 67 at 11:30 on a Sunday evening in October, with a storm pressing down from the northwest, and the temperature dropping 5 degrees every hour, and nothing ahead of him for 25 miles except road and darkness and the particular quality of his own company that he had been unable to escape since Wednesday. The wind picked up as he passed mile marker 200. He leaned into it without thinking, the adjustment automatic. The bike tracking true despite the gust that had come off the mesa to his right, with enough force to push a less experienced rider sideways. Rain had been falling for the past 40 minutes. Not heavy yet, but gaining in tension. His visor was wet, and the road ahead was shining black under his headlight. The painted center line slick and reflective. He was not thinking about anything specific. That was the value of the road in moments like this, the way it demanded enough physical attention to occupy the part of the brain that otherwise circled and circled without landing. You could not ride this road in this weather and also dwell. The road would not allow it. You gave it what it asked for, and in return, it gave you something close to quiet. He was in that quiet when his headlight caught the guardrail, or rather the absence of it. There was a section of the rail between mile marker 213 and 215 that had been in marginal condition for years. The kind of infrastructure that existed in a state of permanent deferred maintenance in underfunded counties. Dax had noticed it before without thinking much about it, the way you notice things along a familiar road that you had cataloged and filed and did not revisit. But something had changed in that section tonight. He slowed without deciding to. The guardrail on the left side of the road had been pushed outward. Not dramatically, not in the way that movie crashes looked, but in the specific and unmistakable way of an impact. The rail bowed away from the road at an angle that did not occur naturally. 2 of the anchor posts leaning at degrees they were not designed to lean at. And on the road itself, where his headlight caught the surface at the angle of deceleration, there were parallel tracks in the wet asphalt that were darker than the surrounding road, the kind of marks that happened when tires locked up and dragged. He pulled to the shoulder and stopped. The engine idled. Rain came down steadily now. He sat for a moment looking at the damaged rail and the marks on the road, and listening to the sound the desert made when the wind came through it at this hour, which was a sound that felt very old and very indifferent to the small things happening at its edge. He thought about Cutter, not in words, just the weight of it, the specific gravity of a person who was no longer in the world pressing against the inside of his chest, in the way it had pressed for 4 days. He thought about a road not unlike this one. He thought about chrome at the bottom of a wash, and 2 hours of nobody stopping. He killed the engine. The silence hit him immediately, the way it always did when the motor stopped the sudden awareness of everything the sound had been covering. Wind, rain, the tick of cooling metal, and something else further down, something that his ears processed before his mind caught up with it. He was already moving off the bike before he had consciously made the decision to do so. He crossed the shoulder and pushed through the gap in the damaged rail and stood at the edge of the drop. The embankment here was not steep, maybe 8 feet down to a flat gravel area, before the terrain resumed its natural slope toward the dry wash to the south. His headlight from the bike illuminated part of it from above. What it showed him made him move faster. The patrol vehicle was on its side, against a cluster of desert scrub at the base of the embankment, its roof facing him, the passenger side door toward the sky. The emergency light bar was dark. One wheel was still turning slowly, slowing the way wheels did when they had recently stopped being in contact with the ground. The windshield on the driver's side was gone, whether from the impact or from what came after. He could not immediately tell. He was down the embankment in 4 seconds, boots sliding on the wet gravel, one hand on the ground for balance. The vehicle was a Black Ridge PD Patrol SUV. He could see the door markings, the reflective stripe, the badge emblem on the rear panel. The driver's door was open, which was not the same as saying a person had opened it. She was 12 feet from the vehicle. She had been thrown, or she had crawled, or some combination of the two that the marks in the gravel suggested were both partially true. She was lying on her side, one arm extended toward the SUV in a direction that spoke of a last effort to reach something, her uniform torn at the shoulder, her badge tilted at an angle. She wore a Black Ridge Police Department uniform. She was a woman, he could see that now as he reached her, and she was young, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered across her face by rain. He dropped to his knees beside her. The gravel was wet and sharp under him, and he did not notice. His hands found her neck before anything else. 2 fingers pressed into the carotid, and what he found was a pulse that was present and fast and wrong in the way that fast pulses were wrong when they were compensating for blood loss. He looked at her quickly, the kind of look he had learned in years of situations that did not allow for hesitation. The tear at her shoulder, a bruise forming high on her left cheekbone. Her lips slightly parted, her breathing shallow and uneven, the kind of breathing that announced itself as labor. Her service weapon was gone from its holster, not fallen gone. Her radio was on the ground 5 feet to her right, and it had been run over by something. He looked at her abdomen. The uniform fabric was dark there, in a way that was not the same dark as the rest of the wet fabric. He pressed 2 careful fingers against it and felt the warmth and the give that told him what he needed to know, before he pulled his hand back and looked at what the minimal light available showed him. Deep. The wound was deep, and the blood was moving steadily despite the rain, which meant it was fresh enough. And the vessel involved was significant enough that the rain had not yet diluted what was coming out of her to below the threshold of visible loss. He had maybe minutes before the situation changed categories from critical to something worse. He was already unbuttoning his flannel shirt as he assessed this. He stripped it off in one motion and folded it against itself twice thick, the way you wanted padding when the objective was sustained pressure. He pressed it firmly against the wound site with both hands and leaned his weight into it and looked at her face. Her eyelids moved slightly, not opening, just moving the way they moved when something in the brain was still working, even when the body had decided to step back from the immediate problem. He told her to stay with him. He did not raise his voice. He had learned somewhere along the line in situations he did not care to enumerate that raising your voice at a person who was barely conscious did not help them and only communicated panic to anyone else nearby. He kept his voice level. He kept his hands steady. He kept the pressure constant. And he looked at her face, and he talked the same way he would talk to a man. He was watching over, the same way he had talked to men before, in circumstances that varied in their particulars but not in their essential nature. Stay with him, not quit. Think about whatever was waiting at home. Think about coffee tomorrow morning. Think about anything that had a tomorrow attached to it. He got his phone out of his vest pocket with one hand, while keeping most of his weight through the other. His fingers were wet, and the screen resisted briefly before registering the unlock. He dialed, and the call connected. and he gave the location with the efficiency of a man who had given locations to emergency services before mile marker 214 on State Route 67, east of Black Ridge. Officer, down one victim's significant abdominal wound, unconscious but breathing. He needed paramedics now. There was a pause on the other end that lasted less than a second, but that he noticed. He gave his name when asked. He spelled it when asked again. There was another pause. He told them the officer was alive and would remain alive if they moved, and that the discussion of who he was could happen after the ambulance had left the scene. And he kept the pressure on the wound, and he set the phone to speaker on the gravel beside them and went back to using both hands. The rain was heavier now. It came down across both of them without preference and without apology. He was in a t-shirt over soaked gravel in the dark with a stranger's blood on his hands. And the temperature was somewhere in the high 40s and dropping, and none of that was the thing he was thinking about. He was thinking about the pressure, about whether the folded flannel was thick enough, about whether the angle of her body was helping or working against him, about her breathing, which he monitored every 15 seconds, counting the rise and fall of her chest with the part of his attention he could spare from his hands. He was thinking about the road. Not this road specifically, the other one. The one with the dry wash and the gap in the guardrail and 2 hours of nobody stopping. He was thinking about what it meant to be the thing that stopped. He talked to her. He told her the paramedics were coming. He told her the road was empty behind him and it would not take them long. He told her she was not alone on the road tonight, which was the most specific and most true thing he could say to her, though she could not hear it. He heard the first sirens at 11 minutes. They were still distant, but present, the particular quality of emergency sirens in open desert, the way they announced themselves long before they arrived. He did not release pressure. He did not move except to check her breathing, which had stabilized slightly, or at least had not worsened in the way he had feared it might in the first minutes. The lights hit the top of the embankment above him at 12 minutes and 20 seconds. He counted because counting was what you did when you needed the part of your brain that wanted to panic to have something specific to do instead. 3 vehicles he could tell from the sound of the engines. 2 of them came fast and hard and stopped with the specific urgency of people who had been told officer down. The third was slower, arriving perhaps 40 seconds after the first 2, which was a detail he filed without knowing yet why. He heard boots on the road above. He heard voices. He heard the quality of recognition in the voices when they looked over the edge and processed what they were seeing. A quality that was not the same as relief, was not the same as gratitude, but was something older and more conditional. Commands came over the edge of the embankment. Step away from her. Hands up and visible. He kept his hands where they were. He kept the pressure constant. He looked up toward the lights without moving anything that mattered. He told them what he had told the dispatcher. If he moved his hands, she would bleed out before the paramedics reached her. That was not drama. That was the situation. They could act on it however they chose. And that was their call to make. Not his. But the pressure was not moving until someone was there to replace it with something better. 3 seconds. He counted those too. Then a voice from above said, "Get the medics down there now." And the specific quality of the standoff changed. The paramedic who reached her first was a man in his 40s who moved the way people moved when they had done this enough times for their body to be ahead of their thinking. He looked at the wound. He looked at the hands. He looked at Dax, and he asked a single question. "Who packed this?" Dax said nothing. He simply kept his hands where they were until the paramedic had his own in place. And then he slowly, deliberately moved back and let the hands be exchanged. He stood up. His knees were wet with gravel and blood, and he did not look at them. The paramedic said something to his partner that Dax did not hear over the wind, and his partner responded, and then the first paramedic looked back at Dax directly with an expression that carried its own weight. He said she would not have made it to the hospital otherwise. He said it plainly, the way medical people sometimes stated things plainly, when they wanted to be precisely understood without embellishment and without uncertainty. Dax said nothing. He took several steps back from the area around the officer and stood near the base of the embankment with his hands visible at his sides and watched the paramedics work. 2 more officers had come down the slope now, and they positioned themselves in the specific way that law enforcement positioned themselves around a person they had not yet categorized, not hostile enough to escalate, but not trusting enough to relax. One of them was young, a woman in her late 20s, and she kept looking at the wound and then at Dax, and then back at the wound with an expression that was working through several things at once. Dax looked at the damaged guardrail above them, at the marks in the gravel, at the pieces of the scene that told him what had happened before he arrived. The way scenes always told you things if you looked at them with the right kind of patience. Her service weapon was gone. Her radio had been deliberately disabled, not damaged in the crash, but run over afterward by something with a specific wheelbase, the tread marks in the gravel, still legible in the paramedic's work light. She had been hit from behind. He was almost certain of it from the way the vehicle had gone through the rail. And she had been hit at a speed that spoke of intent rather than accident. This was not a collision. This was something that had been done to her. The sergeant who came down the embankment 2 minutes later had the face of a man who had been doing this job for a long time and had developed the specific kind of patience that was indistinguishable from wariness at certain angles. He looked at the scene. He looked at Dax. His gaze went to the patch on the back of the vest Dax had put back on while waiting the red and white Hells Angels insignia that announced itself without apology in the light of the work lamps the paramedics had set up. He told Dax to start talking. Dax told him the same thing he had told the dispatcher in the same order, and with the same economy of words. He had been riding west on 67. He had seen the damaged guardrail and the marks on the road. He had come down and found the officer. He had not seen another vehicle. He had not seen any other person. He had applied pressure to the wound, called 911, and waited. That was everything he knew. The sergeant looked at him for a long time. Dax did not look away. He was not in the habit of looking away from direct attention, and he saw no reason to start. He told the sergeant to check the traffic cameras on the 67, and that whatever they showed would be consistent with what he had just said. The sergeant did not answer this. He told one of the younger officers to take Dax to the 3rd cruiser that had arrived, and to stay with him, and he turned back to the paramedics who were doing the kind of rapid, focused work that did not leave room for observation. The 3rd cruiser was the one that had arrived last. As Dax walked toward it with the young officer beside him, he passed close enough to get a clear look at the man standing near the driver's door. He was in his early 50s, heavy set in the specific way of a man who had once been physically capable and had allowed that capability to become something else over time. He wore a detective's badge on a lanyard rather than on his chest. His jacket was dry in the way that a jacket was dry when you had spent less time in the rain than the situation called for. He was looking at the scene below with an expression that Dax could not fully read in the available light. But he could read the edges of it. He had been around enough people in enough situations to know the difference between the expression of a person encountering a problem and the expression of a person encountering a problem they already knew about. It was a subtle difference. It lived in the quality of the stillness rather than in any specific feature of the face. A person encountering something new was in motion, even when standing still, processing, reaching toward understanding. A person encountering something familiar was still in a different way. Quieter, the processing happening in a place that was already partially finished with the work. This man was still in the second way. He did not look at Dax directly as Dax passed. He kept his eyes on the scene below, but in the half-second when they were at the closest point, something in his posture changed slightly. A micro-adjustment in the direction of awareness, and Dax registered it and filed it the way he filed things along unfamiliar roads, cataloging without yet knowing why. The young officer opened the rear door of the cruiser, and Dax got in. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched the detective come down the embankment and approach the scene. He watched him crouch near the tire marks in the gravel, the ones that were not from the patrol vehicle but from whatever had made them. He watched him look at the marks for a long time without touching them. He watched him take out his phone and make a call that lasted less than a minute. His body angled away from the other officers in the way that bodies angled when a call was private. Dax sat in the back of the cruiser and let himself be wet and cold, and he watched through the window and he thought about the way that man had been still. Inside the ambulance, whose rear doors were open while the paramedics worked the officer's chest, was rising and falling with more regularity than it had on the gravel. A small thing. The kind of thing that did not look like much from the outside and meant everything. He had not asked her name. He did not know it yet. She was the officer on the road, and she was alive. And both of those things were true, because he had pulled over on a stretch of highway where there was nothing particular to pull over for. He thought about Cutter, not the message this time, earlier than that. The first year he had ridden with the chapter when Dax had been new and Cutter had been 3 years in and already had the easy authority of a man who had decided who he was and was comfortable being that person. Cutter had told him once early on that the patch did not make you anything. It was just cloth and thread. What you did in the dark when nobody was counting was the only thing that actually accumulated. The only thing that built into something real over time. Dax had thought about that many times in the years since. He was thinking about it now in the back of a cruiser with gravel in his boots and another man's blood on his hands, and the cold coming through the windows in the way cold came through windows that were not designed for comfort, and the detective outside on the phone with whoever he was calling at midnight in the middle of State Route 67. The lieutenant arrived 20 minutes later. Traffic camera footage would not be available until morning. But the sergeant had already made the request and had been told the cameras at the relevant positions were functional, and that the footage would be pulled as soon as the access protocols were followed. He came to the cruiser himself to speak with Dax, which was a different level of attention than the cruiser detail warranted. And he asked the same questions the sergeant had asked and received the same answers. Then he said something that the sergeant had not said. He said the paramedics' preliminary assessment had been that the wound had been packed correctly, which in his experience was not something that happened accidentally. And he asked Dax where he had learned to do it. Dax told him it was not the first time he had needed to know. The lieutenant looked at him with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something. He did not say anything further about it. He told Dax they would need a statement in the morning, asked him to come to the department by 9, and told the young officer to take his contact information. Then he went back to the scene and Dax watched through the wet window as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began moving slowly at first and then with purpose up the access path to the road where its lights came on, and it accelerated west toward Black Ridge. He sat in the silence after it left and looked at the space where it had been. The detective was still on the periphery of the scene. He had a notebook out now, or something that looked like a notebook, in the work light, and he was writing in it. He had been at the scene for nearly 40 minutes, and Dax had not yet seen him speak to anyone other than the person on the phone. He had also not approached the young officer to ask what Dax had said. That was the kind of thing people who wanted information did in Dax's experience. They asked the person who had the information. If you did not ask, you were either already satisfied with what you knew, or you were not interested in what the information would add to your picture. The detective was not asking, which meant one of those two things was true. Dax looked out at the road above the embankment, at the place where the guardrail had been, and where the gap now showed. The rain had eased to something between drizzle and thought, still present, but no longer insistent. The desert floor beyond the embankment was dark and flat, and extended to a horizon he could not see in the current conditions. Somewhere out there between here and wherever he had come from, and wherever he was going, there was a man who had run a police officer off the road and taken her weapon and left her in the dark. That man had driven away from mile marker 214 and continued wherever he was going. Dax thought about what kind of a man drove away from what he had left behind him. He thought about the detective with his notebook and his phone call, and the specific quality of his stillness when he had first come down the embankment and looked at the scene. He thought about Cutter, which he could not seem to stop doing, but this time the thought had a different edge to it. Not the edge of the message, not the 6 words in "The road's bad tonight," and the silence that had followed. The edge of what Cutter had said about the only things that actually accumulated. The young officer returned to the cruiser and took down a number and a name on a form that already had a case number printed at the top. Dax gave him what he was asked for. The name on the form matched the patch on the vest. He watched the officer look from the form to the patch and back to the form and write it down. Without comment, the professional neutrality of a young person doing a job they had been trained to do in the specific way they had been trained to do it. He was released at 1:30 in the morning. His bike was still on the shoulder where he had left it undisturbed. He checked it out of habit, the things you checked when a motorcycle had been sitting unattended in conditions you had not anticipated. Everything was as he had left it. He put on his helmet. He looked down at his hands, which were dry now, but still showed the traces of what they had done in the way that hands showed things long after the fact, in the lines and the spaces between the knuckles. He started the engine. He did not immediately pull out onto the road. He sat for a moment with the engine running and the headlight illuminating the damaged guardrail and the gap in it, the gap where the gravel showed the marks of what had come through it. The gap that he had caught in his headlight with 2 seconds to spare before he would have been past it. He thought about how close the margin was in situations like this, how thin the line between the road that had someone stop and the road that did not. How many factors had to align or fail to align for a person to be on the right stretch of highway at the right speed, at the exact moment when being there could make a difference. He thought about Cutter on the other road, with the dry wash and the chrome, catching the headlights of a man in a pickup truck who had angled his lights the right way by accident, 2 hours too late. He thought about the text message in his pocket that he had not looked at since he had read it for the 17th time that morning. He pulled out onto State Route 67 and rode east toward Black Ridge, with the rain clearing and the stars beginning to appear at the edges of the storm, and the road stretching out ahead of him, in the headlight empty and familiar, and requiring everything he had to give it, which tonight was less than usual. but still enough. In the precinct on Alcott Street in Black Ridge, a detective named Cal Pruitt sat alone in his car in the parking structure for 22 minutes after returning from the scene. He was not on his phone during this time. He was not writing in his notebook. He was looking at the windshield, which showed him the concrete wall of the parking structure in the yellow cast of the overhead lights. And he was thinking. He had been thinking since the moment the dispatch call had come through on his radio, and the location had registered, and the description of the vehicle involved had registered, and his stomach had done what his stomach did. When two things he had been keeping carefully separate suddenly became the same thing. Vic Sadler had driven a dark-colored sedan. Vic Sadler had a history that Pruitt knew about in ways that were not currently documented in any active file. Vic Sadler had been the subject of 3 separate reports over the past 8 months. Reports that had arrived on Pruitt's desk and been marked and processed in the way that things were marked and processed when a person in a particular position decided that a particular piece of paper needed to travel a particular direction rather than the one it was headed. None of those reports were in the system. That was the thing that Pruitt sat with in his car in the parking structure for 22 minutes. The thing that was not in the system. The thing that would not stay not in the system if the right people started asking the right questions in the right order. He had a name for the biker now. Dax Harlow. He had pulled it off the young officer's form when the officer had set the clipboard down for 30 seconds to help with the equipment. He had memorized it in the way he memorized things efficiently, and without writing them down the way he handled things, he did not want to exist in notes. Dax Harlow had a history. He had found that out in the parking structure with his phone and 12 minutes of searching. There was a civil litigation matter from 6 years ago in a neighboring county. A complaint involving a traffic stop and an allegation that had been eventually settled without admission. It was the kind of thing that, presented in the right framing, suggested a pattern of adversarial behavior toward law enforcement that could serve a particular narrative. Not a perfect tool, but a tool. He sat in the parking structure for 22 minutes, and he thought about tools, and about the things that were not in the system, and about a woman in a hospital bed who was alive when she should not have been, which was a complication. He had not built into any calculation he had made in the past 8 months. Then he got out of his car and went inside to write his incident report. Sylvia Mercer left for work at 7:42 on Thursday morning. Dax had been parked on the cross street for 20 minutes before she appeared, watching the house from the angle that gave him the most without giving anything away. The silver sedan backed out of the driveway with the careful precision of someone who did everything in the observable world with care. She was dressed for the office, composed. She looked from the distance of 200 feet, and through the windshield of a truck she had never seen like a woman who had slept well and was having an ordinary Thursday. She did not look like a woman who had tied a child to a tree 2 nights before. He went to the department at 9 in the morning as asked. He sat in a chair that had been placed in a room that was not an interview room but was not a waiting room either. A middle space that departments used when they wanted to talk to someone without the formal implications of the other option. A detective he had not seen before asked him the same questions that had been asked twice already in the same order, and Dax gave the same answers in the same order, which was the only sensible approach to being asked the same question multiple times by different people. Consistency was not a strategy. It was just what happened when you were telling the truth. He was there for an hour and 20 minutes. When he left, the morning was bright and cold in the way October mornings in the high desert were bright and cold. The kind of clarity that arrived after a storm had spent all its intention and left the air with nothing in it but itself. He rode back to his place on the east edge of Black Ridge, the small house with the detached garage that had been the actual reason he bought the property, and he pulled into the garage and sat on the bike for a moment after the engine stopped. He had a camera system. It was not elaborate, the kind of setup you bought because motorcycles were expensive and the neighborhood, while not dangerous, had enough foot traffic at odd hours to make the precautions sensible. 2 exterior cameras on the garage, one on the front of the house, and the camera mounted to the fairing of the bike itself, a forward-facing unit he had installed 2 years ago after a near miss with a truck that had drifted into his lane on the interstate. And he had wanted afterward to have a record of things like that if they happened again. He had not thought about the bike camera since before the cemetery. He thought about it now. He went inside and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and pulled the footage from the camera's memory card, which still held everything from the past 72 hours, because he had not cleared it since before the funeral. He started at the timestamp that corresponded to when he had left Black Ridge on Sunday evening and moved forward at normal speed. Watching the road come at him through the rain, the headlight reaching out ahead, and the dark pressing in on both sides. The familiar progression of mile markers going by at the pace of a man riding steadily but without hurry. He watched himself slow down. He watched the damaged guardrail appear in the upper right of the frame, the way the headlight caught the section of bent metal at the specific angle that had drawn his attention. He watched the shoulder approach and the frame tilt as he pulled over. Then the camera was pointed at the scrub on the road's edge, and the remaining footage from that location showed nothing useful. The angle all wrong once the bike was stationary. He went back and watched the approach again. He watched it 4 more times, paying attention to the road ahead, rather than the guardrail. Looking at what had been visible before the guardrail became the focus. The rain reduced visibility, but not to zero. The headlight reached far enough. The road was empty ahead of him by the time he came around the last bend before 214 empty in the frame for the full 45 seconds before the guardrail appeared. He moved back further, to the bend itself, to what had been visible in the seconds before the bend when the road ahead had been at an angle and the headlight had swept across the shoulder on the far side of the curve. He stopped the footage. He leaned closer to the screen, at the edge of the headlight's reach on the right shoulder of the road, approximately 200 meters ahead of where the curve straightened. There was a vehicle. It was visible for less than 2 seconds as the headlights swept across it before the angle changed and it passed out of frame. Dark, colored, sedan profile, parked tight against the shoulder with its lights off. He watched it again. And again, the vehicle was there. It was not a trick of the light or a shadow resolving into a shape because he was looking for one. It was a vehicle parked on the shoulder of State Route 67, approximately 200 meters north of where a police officer had gone through a guardrail, with its lights off at 11:30 on a Sunday night in a storm. He sat back and held his coffee cup and looked at the frozen frame on his laptop. A vehicle parked on that stretch of road at that hour, with its lights off, had no innocent explanation that he could construct. And he had tried to construct one for approximately 30 seconds before stopping, because the attempt was dishonest. People did not park on the shoulder of a desert highway in a storm in the middle of the night, with their lights off because they needed a moment to check their phone or look at a map. People parked on the shoulder of a desert highway at midnight, with their lights off when they were doing something they did not want to be seen doing and had made a calculation about how long they needed to stay in the area before moving on. The calculation in this case had apparently been wrong by approximately 3 minutes. He looked at the image quality. It was not good. The rain and the distance and the angle conspired to produce a frame that showed the shape of a vehicle and the approximate color, and nothing more. No plate, no make, Not enough of the profile to be certain of the model, only the general category of sedan, rather than truck or SUV. It was something. Whether it was enough was a question he did not yet have the information to answer. He saved the segment to a separate file and copied it to a thumb drive and sat at the table for a while longer, finishing his coffee and thinking about where to take it and to whom. The obvious answer was the department. The obvious answer was to call the number the lieutenant had given him and say he had footage from his bike camera that might be relevant and to bring it in. The obvious answer assumed that the relevant people at the department were working toward the same objective he was, which was establishing who had been on that road and why. He thought about Cal Pruitt. He thought about what he knew about how information moved in closed systems when one of the people in the system had a reason to direct it. He did not have enough yet to make a definitive assessment of what Pruitt was doing. He had an impression built from the specific quality of a man's stillness on a wet embankment at midnight. And impressions were not conclusions, and conclusions were not facts. And he had learned the hard way over 45 years that acting on one when you needed the other was how situations went wrong in ways that were hard to correct. He needed more before he moved. He put the thumb drive in his vest pocket and went to work. The chapter did not have an intelligence operation in any formal sense. What it had was a collection of men who had been living in and around Black Ridge for a combined total of several centuries. Men who worked in garages and on job sites and in the backs of supply houses and behind the counters of places that other people walked through without noticing the man behind the counter. Men who heard things. Men who had been hearing things for long enough to know the difference between noise and signal. He spent Monday asking quiet questions. He did not ask about Pruitt directly. He asked about the department in general, about the mood in it, about what people were saying about Sunday night. He asked in the way that did not announce itself as asking in the way of conversations that started somewhere else and arrived at the subject through the natural drift of talk between men who had known each other for years. By Tuesday evening, he had a picture. Cal Pruitt had been with the department for 19 years. He was by the account of people who had interacted with him in various capacities, effective in the specific and limited way of a person who was good at the procedural requirements of the job and less good at the human ones. He had a reputation for closing cases cleanly, which in some jurisdictions meant closing them correctly, and in others meant closing them in whatever way produced the fewest complications. He was known to have relationships with several figures in the county who were not law enforcement, but who operated in adjacent spaces, the kind of relationships that were not corrupt in any documentable sense, but that explained certain patterns of outcome if you looked at them over time. This was not evidence. This was context. Dax let the context sit in his mind alongside everything else and waited to see if it would organize itself into something useful. Wednesday morning, day 3 from the night at mile marker 214, he got a call from a number he recognized as the department. It was not the lieutenant. The woman on the phone identified herself as working in administrative services and said she was calling to inform him that a supplemental report had been filed in connection with the incident of Sunday night, and that he might be contacted for further questioning. She said it in the flat, careful way of someone reading from a script that had been given to them and told to read without addition. He asked her what the supplemental report contained. She said she was not able to provide that information over the phone and that he should expect correspondence. He thanked her and ended the call and sat on the workbench in his garage for a moment with the phone in his hand. Supplemental reports were not unusual in complex incident investigations. They were filed when new information emerged or when the initial report was deemed incomplete. They were a standard tool of the process. They were also a standard tool of the other thing, the thing that processes became when someone inside them decided that the process needed to produce a particular result rather than an accurate one. He called a man named Royce Delafield. Royce was 61 years old and had been a chapter member for 32 years before his knees had made the riding impractical, and he had transitioned into the particular category of elder that chapters accumulated over time. Men who were no longer on the road, but who retained their connections and their knowledge and their interest in the ongoing concerns of the people they had ridden with. Royce had spent 11 of his pre-chapter years working as a paralegal at a firm in Albuquerque, a fact that had proven useful at various points over the decades. Dax told him about the call. Royce was quiet for a moment. Then he said that a supplemental report filed within 72 hours of an incident. Before the primary investigation had produced its initial findings, was not a standard procedural move. It was the kind of move you made when you wanted to establish a narrative in the record before the record had a chance to develop on its own terms. Dax asked him what that meant practically. Royce said it meant that someone had decided to put something in writing before anyone could put something else in writing first. He asked who would file it. Royce said the filing detective's name would be on it, and that he could probably find out what was in it if he gave it a day or two, that he knew someone who knew someone in the administrative structure of the Black Ridge Department. The kind of connection that existed in small cities between people who had been in the same professional ecosystem for long enough. Dax said a day or two was fine. He went back to the footage. He had been thinking about the sedan since Monday morning, and he had been thinking about it specifically in terms of what additional information the footage might yield that he had not yet extracted. The shape and the approximate color were the only things the primary image contained with any confidence. But footage was not only the frame, it was also the context around the frame, the road conditions, the visibility, the precise location, which could be cross-referenced with the geography. He pulled up a satellite image of State Route 67 around mile marker 214 and compared the shoulder geometry to what was visible in the footage frame. The vehicle had been parked at a specific point where the shoulder was wider than average, a pullout area that existed at irregular intervals on the highway for emergency use. The pullout at that location was the closest one to the guardrail section that had been damaged, which meant whoever had parked there had chosen it deliberately, which meant they had been familiar with the road. He wrote this down in the notebook he kept on the workbench for things he did not want to lose track of, the same notebook where he wrote part specifications and torque values and the occasional reminder about a bill that needed paying. Thursday was day 4. He rode past the section of 67 in the daylight, slowly on the far side of the road from the damaged guardrail. The sheriff's department had been there before him. There were evidence markers still visible at the embankment access point, and the rail itself had been flagged with yellow tape. He did not stop. He noted the distance between the pullout where the sedan had been and the break in the rail, and calculated it on the odometer. 212 meters. Close enough to observe. Far enough to not be obviously at the scene. He rode back to Black Ridge and spent the afternoon in his garage, working on a carburetor rebuild for a customer's vintage bike that needed his hands to stay busy so his mind could work on the other thing without the friction of inactivity. Royce called at 6 on Thursday evening. The supplemental report had been filed by Detective Cal Pruitt. It described the incident as follows: an individual with known affiliations to an outlaw motorcycle organization had been found at the scene of an injured officer, under circumstances that in the filing detective's professional assessment warranted further investigation. The report noted the individual's prior involvement in a civil litigation matter related to a law enforcement interaction in an adjacent county. It noted that the individual's account of events had not yet been corroborated by physical evidence. It raised the question in the language that reports used when they wanted to raise questions without making direct allegations of whether the individual's presence at the scene might have preceded the incident rather than followed it. Dax listened to Royce read the relevant sections from notes. He was quiet for a moment after Royce finished. Then he said he needed Royce to look into something for him. He needed whatever was publicly available on a man named Vic Sadler, Black Ridge area. And he needed to know if Sadler had any documented history with the department, or with Pruitt specifically. Royce asked how he knew the name. Dax said he did not know the name yet, that he was still working on it, but that he expected to have it within the next 24 hours. Royce said to call when he had it. Friday was day 5. He had not slept well on Thursday night, which was not unusual for him in the current period, but which had a different quality than the preceding nights. The previous sleeplessness had been the sleeplessness of grief, which was a recognizable condition, with a recognizable texture. The specific way that the mind refused to stop returning to a fixed point, no matter how many times you redirected it. This sleeplessness was different. It was the sleeplessness of a mind that was working, that had a problem in it, and was turning the problem over, and looking at the faces of it, and had not yet found the angle that made everything fit together. He got up at 4 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table with the footage open on his laptop. The phone was on the table beside the laptop. He had gotten into the habit of leaving it face down since the funeral. Not because he could not look at the screen, but because he had been in a period of not wanting to. The screen faced down, and the message was still in it. The same 6 words. It had always been undeleted and unanswered, and waiting in the way that things waited when there was nothing left for them to do except remain. He looked at the footage for a long time without seeing anything he had not already seen. Then he picked up the phone. He turned it face up and looked at the screen, and unlocked it and navigated to the message thread, and looked at the last message the way he had looked at it 17 times before. The timestamp, the 6 words, the lack of anything after them. Heading home. Road's bad tonight. He set the phone face down again. He looked at the frozen frame on the laptop, the dark sedan at the edge of the headlight's reach, the shoulder of the road, the rain. He thought about a man who had driven away from what he had left behind him, who had driven past a woman he had put on the ground and kept going because the road was bad and the night was dark and nobody had been there yet, and the calculation had said that the window was still open. He thought about windows. He went back to the footage, and this time he did not start at the moment he had slowed. He started 10 seconds before the bend further back at the stretch of road where his headlight had reached toward the pullout. He had looked at this section before, but he had been looking at the vehicle shape, confirming what he already knew was there. He had not been looking at the road surface. He watched the headlights sweep across the asphalt as he came around the bend. He watched the pavement come into frame. He stopped the footage. He leaned so close to the screen that the image resolved into individual pixels at the edges. On the road surface, visible for less than a second in the headlight, sweep before the angle carried the frame past. There were marks on the wet asphalt that were not the regular surface texture. Curved marks. The kind that happened when a vehicle accelerated away from a standing start, and the rear tires broke traction briefly on a wet surface before catching. Acceleration marks, pointing south, away from the direction of Black Ridge, made recently enough that the rain had not yet fully dissolved them. The sedan had been there, and it had left. He had arrived approximately 3 minutes after it left. He sat with that for a long time. Then he called Holt Brennan. He had the captain's direct number from the card the lieutenant had given him on Sunday night, which had the lieutenant's number on it, and Brennan's number written in the lieutenant's handwriting on the back as a secondary contact. He had not used it. He used it now. Brennan answered on the third ring with the voice of a man who had been awake for a while and was not surprised to still be awake. Dax said he had footage from his bike camera that he believed was relevant to the investigation, and that he wanted to bring it in, and that he wanted to bring it directly to Brennan. There was a pause. Brennan asked him why directly to him. Dax said he had become aware of a supplemental report that had been filed by a member of Brennan's department, and that he would prefer to deliver the footage through a channel that did not involve that individual. Another pause. Longer this time. Brennan said to come in at 8 the next morning and to ask for him specifically, and not to speak to anyone else in the building before they had talked. Dax said he understood. He made a second copy of the relevant footage segment and put it on a second thumb drive and put the 2 drives in separate locations. Then he went to the garage and worked on the carburetor until his hands were tired enough to let his mind rest. Saturday morning, day 6, he brought the footage to Brennan. He sat in Brennan's office, which was a room with a window that looked onto a parking structure and a desk with a controlled amount of paper on it. And he walked Brennan through the footage frame by frame. Brennan watched it without speaking. He watched it twice. Then he called someone into the room, a younger man who was introduced as working in technical analysis, and had him look at it. The technical analyst said the image quality was insufficient to produce a plate number, but that the vehicle profile and the approximate dimensions were potentially matchable to a specific make and model range if they had something to compare it to. Brennan looked at Dax. Dax said he did not have a name to give him yet. He said he was working on it. He said the location and the timing of the vehicle placed it in a position that had no innocent explanation, and that someone in the investigation should be looking at who drove that road on Sunday night and where they went afterward. Brennan said he would have someone look at it. He said it in the way that a man said things when he was telling the truth, but was also aware that the truth existed inside a larger structure that complicated his ability to act on it as directly as he might prefer. Dax left the footage with him and went home. The call from Royce came Saturday evening. Royce had found what he was looking for, which was to say that he had found more than Dax had asked for, which was the way it went when you asked someone with Royce's particular history to look into something. The name Vic Sadler appeared in 3 separate incident reports filed with the Black Ridge PD over the preceding 8 months. The first report, filed 8 months ago, concerned a complaint from a woman in the county's East District about a vehicle matching a description that included a dark-colored sedan following her on multiple occasions. The second, filed 5 months ago, concerned an altercation at a gas station in which Sadler had been identified by a witness as having threatened a male motorist who had confronted him about erratic driving. The third, filed 6 weeks before Sunday night, concerned an incident in which a neighbor had reported Sadler sitting in his vehicle outside a private residence for an extended period with his lights off. All 3 reports had been received by the department. None of them had resulted in an investigation being opened. All 3 had been routed through the same detective at intake. Dax asked Royce to say the name. Royce said it. Cal Pruitt. Dax sat with that for the length of time it took to fully understand what it meant, which was not long because he had been building toward it since Monday, and the final piece did not require much work to fit into the structure he had assembled. 3 reports, 8 months. The same detective at intake. No investigation opened on any of them. A pattern that could taken alone be explained as oversight, as the normal backlog of an underfunded department, making triage decisions about what rose to the level of active investigation. Possible. Not impossible. Except that the same detective who had not opened an investigation on any of those 3 reports was the same detective who had arrived last at a scene on Sunday night and had stood apart from the other officers and made a phone call. He had angled his body to conceal and had written an incident note that suggested the person who had saved the victim's life was the more appropriate subject of scrutiny. That was not oversight. He called Royce back and told him to find out if there was any documented connection between Pruitt and Sadler, anything at all. Any shared address or vehicle registration or family connection or financial relationship that was findable through public records. Royce said he would look. Sunday was day 7. He went to the garage and worked in the morning, and in the afternoon he took the bike out on a short ride. Not the long, aimless kind he had done the night he found Nora Kirsch, but a deliberate one. A loop through the county roads east of Black Ridge that he used when he needed his body to be doing something physical, so his mind could work without the friction of standing still. He was 20 miles out when his phone rang. It was a number he did not recognize with a prefix from a county 2 over to the north. The man on the other end identified himself as a detective with the Harmon County Sheriff's Department and said he was calling because they had a person in custody in connection with an incident in their county, and that some materials found on the person appeared to connect to an incident in Black Ridge, and he was checking to see whether there was a relevant open investigation. Dax said he was not in a position to speak to that officially, but that he had been involved in an incident in Black Ridge on the previous Sunday night, and that if the detective could describe the person in custody, he might be able to say whether there was a connection. The detective described Vic Sadler. Dax said there was very likely a connection and gave him Brennan's name and number. He pulled over on the county road and sat on the bike with the engine idling and the desert around him, doing what the desert did in the late afternoon of a clear October day, which was to say it sat in a light that made everything look more permanent than it was. Sadler was in custody. That meant the investigation would now expand in a direction that would make the contents of those 3 reports relevant, which meant that someone was going to ask why 3 reports about Vic Sadler had been routed to the same detective and produced no investigative action, and that someone was going to ask that detective to explain the pattern. He called Brennan. Brennan answered immediately, which suggested either that he had been waiting for calls or that Sadler's arrest had already reached him. It had already reached him. Dax asked him about the 3 reports. There was a silence on the other end that told him Brennan had not known about the 3 reports until very recently. He told Brennan about Royce's research, not Royce by name, just the substance of what had been found, the 3 reports, the routing, the outcome. He gave Brennan the report numbers as Royce had given them to him, so that Brennan could pull them from the system. Brennan said he would look into it. He said it in a different voice than he had used before. The previous voice had been the voice of a man managing a situation that was unpleasant but contained. This voice was the voice of a man who had just understood that the container was smaller than he had thought. Monday was day 8. He was in the garage working when the second car pulled into his driveway. He had been expecting the first car. It was a county vehicle unmarked, but with the plate format and the antenna configuration that announced what it was, and it contained a man he had not seen before, who showed him a badge and said he was with the county district attorney's investigative unit and that they were looking into some matters related to the Black Ridge PD and that they would like to formally interview him about the events of the previous Sunday night. Dax gave the interview in his kitchen with the man from the DA's unit and a second person who joined by phone 40 minutes of the same questions he had answered 4 times already, and some new ones about the footage and about how he had come to be aware of the supplemental report. He answered all of them. After the DA's investigator left, he went back to the garage. The second car arrived at 20 minutes past 4. He knew it was Pruitt's car before the man got out of it. He had gotten Pruitt's plate number from Royce on Saturday, the kind of information that was publicly available if you knew where to look, and had someone who knew where to look and the plate matched. He watched through the garage window as Pruitt got out of the car and straightened his jacket and looked at the garage, the way a person looked at a space they were approaching with a purpose they had decided on ahead of time. Dax came out of the garage and stood in the driveway. He did not say anything. He waited. Pruitt stopped about 10 feet away. He looked around the property in the casual way of a man making a general survey rather than looking for anything specific. The way that was actually looking for things while pretending not to. Then he said, Cutter Marsh. He said the name the way you said the name of a subject you had researched, with the slight flatness of a person pronouncing something they had read rather than heard. He said he had been looking into the chapter. He said he had found some things in connection with Cutter Marsh's accident that raised questions. He said that in the current environment with the DA's office making inquiries, there were a lot of files that were going to be opened and reviewed, and that some of those files touched on chapter business in ways that might not be comfortable. He said all of this in the measured tone of a man conveying information, rather than making a threat in the careful language of someone who understood exactly what he was doing, and had decided that the language made it something other than what it was. Dax listened to all of it. Then he looked at Pruitt with the same directness he used for everything, and said, You're in the wrong place. Not a threat. Not an escalation. Just a statement of fact, delivered in the register of a man who had made his assessment and was not interested in renegotiating it. Pruitt looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating. Then he got back in his car and drove away. Dax stood in his driveway and watched the car go, and then went back into the garage and picked up the tool he had set down and went back to work. He worked until 8 that evening. The carburetor was finished. The customer's bike was ready. He cleaned his tools and put them away in the order he always put them away, and turned off the garage lights and went inside and sat at the kitchen table. The notification from Royce had come in at 6:40 while he was working, and he had felt the phone vibrate in his pocket and left it. He read it now. Royce had found the connection. Vic Sadler's sister had been in a relationship with a man who had worked at the same firm where Pruitt's brother-in-law was a managing partner. A connection 2 steps removed, indirect, the kind that would not mean anything in isolation and would not be documentable as corruption in any direct sense. But a connection. The kind that explained certain patterns of outcome when taken with everything else. He forwarded the information to Brennan. Then he sat at the table for a while longer. The phone was face up. He had been leaving it face up since Friday, since the morning he had picked it up and looked at the message and set it back down. He was not sure when exactly he had started leaving it face up. He had not made a decision about it. It had just started being that way. He looked at the screen. The notification from Royce had pushed the message thread down the home screen. He had to scroll slightly to see it. He scrolled and looked at it. 6 words. The timestamp. The DA's office had called Brennan that afternoon. Royce had told him in a separate message. They were opening a formal review of the 3 Sadler reports and the intake routing. They would be looking at Pruitt's conduct. The timeline was going to be examined. The patterns were going to be visible to people with the authority and the mandate to look at them. Dax had not done this alone. Royce had helped. Brennan had been willing to look at what was brought to him. The DA's office had its own reasons and its own authority. It was not a single man's work, but a single man had started it at mile marker 214 by pulling a thumb drive out of his vest pocket and looking at footage he had almost not looked at. And a single man had found the thread. He locked the phone screen and left it face up on the table and went to bed. And for the first time since Wednesday the previous week, he slept until the light came through the window. Brennan called Tuesday morning to say that the Internal Affairs Division had been notified of the review and that Pruitt had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. He said this in the careful language of a captain informing a civilian of a departmental matter with the appropriate distances preserved. But the information carried its own weight regardless of the language it was dressed in. He said there was going to be a formal proceeding, a departmental hearing, the kind that happened when the review produced sufficient grounds for a formal response. He said Dax might be asked to appear and provide testimony. Dax said he understood. He was quiet for a moment after the call. Then he put on his jacket and went out to the garage and started the bike and rode east on the county road in the Tuesday morning light. Not to anywhere specific, just moving the way the road sometimes required, nothing more than that. You keep moving through it. And he thought about the proceeding that was coming and about the footage on the thumb drive in his vest pocket and about the 10 days between mile marker 214 and whatever was going to happen next. He thought about Pruitt in the driveway saying Cutter Marsh's name with the flatness of a man who had researched it. He thought about a man named Vic Sadler in a room in Harmon County with the specific quality of stillness that came from knowing the window had closed. He thought about the hearing. He thought about what it would mean to walk into that room and say what he knew in the plain declarative way he said everything without apology and without performance. And he thought about what it would cost and what it would do, and whether the doing of it was the kind of thing that accumulated the way Cutter had said. The real things accumulated over time in the dark, when nobody was keeping count. He thought he knew the answer to that. He rode until the road ran straight into the distance, and the desert opened up on both sides, and the sky was as clear as it was gonna be. And then he turned around and headed back toward Black Ridge, and the thing that was waiting there for him to walk into it. The night before the hearing, Dax sat at the kitchen table and did not sleep. This was different from the sleeplessness of the preceding 2 weeks. The earlier nights had been the sleeplessness of grief, which had a texture he recognized by now, the specific circling quality of a mind that kept returning to the same fixed point, regardless of how many times he directed it elsewhere. That sleeplessness was exhausting in the way that fighting something exhausting was. This was not that. This was the sleeplessness of a man who had arrived at the edge of something large and was standing at the edge, looking at the shape of it. Clearly, not afraid of it, not eager for it, simply present with the fact of it and with the understanding that the morning would come, at the pace it was going to come at, and that there was nothing useful he could do about that except be ready when it did. The 3 reports were in a folder on the table. He had printed them from the copies Royce had sourced, each one showing the date of receipt and the routing notation and the outcome designation and the detective's intake signature at the bottom of the confirmation field. He had organized them with the oldest on top. 8 months ago. 5 months ago. 6 weeks before the night on State Route 67. 3 documents, 3 dates, the same signature on each one. Beside the folder, he had the technical document from Brennan's analyst, the formal assessment of the bike camera footage that stated in precise technical language what the footage could and could not support as an evidentiary claim. He had the timestamp record showing the GPS coordinates and the time markers. He had his own written account of everything from the moment he had left the Chapter Roadhouse after Cutter's funeral reception to the morning of the interview with the DA's investigator. 4 pages in his own handwriting, plain declarative sentences in chronological order, stating what he had seen and done and understood and in what sequence. He had the thumb drive. He had looked at all of it together many times in the past several days. He was not looking at it now for new information. He was sitting with it the way you sat with things you had done the work on and understood you could not do more work on, where the only remaining variable was the room it was going into and the people in that room, and whether the thing you had built would hold under the specific conditions of being presented to strangers who did not know you and had no reason to begin from trust. He had been in rooms before where that was the condition, where the starting position was suspicion rather than openness, and the work was to move it not through persuasion, but through the weight of what was true being said, plainly by someone who was not asking the room to like them, but only asking it to look at what was on the table. He knew how to be in those rooms. He picked up the phone. He had been leaving it face up since the Friday before last, and the practice had settled into something automatic. He navigated to the message thread and read the last message the way he had read it many times, but with the specific quality of attention of a person reading something for what might be the last time, in a particular way. Heading home. Road's bad tonight. He had carried these words through grief, and through the specific guilt of the not responding, and through the 2 weeks of work that had followed, and he had arrived at a place tonight where he understood something about them that he had not understood before. Not a new fact about the words, a new relationship to them. The words were Cutter heading home. That was all they had ever been. A man moving through bad conditions in the direction of where he belonged, doing what he did, sending a message because keeping a person informed of your location was a form of saying that person mattered to you. Cutter had sent this kind of message 100 times. None of the previous ones had been the last one. This one had been the last one not because it was different from the others, but because the road had been what it was that night, and Cutter had been on it. The not responding did not change what the message was. It never had. He had known this intellectually since the first days. What he understood tonight was that he had been using the not responding as a way of staying inside the grief, rather than working through it as a way of holding the wound open. Because the wound was the last immediate connection to the person who had made it, and closing it or letting it begin to close felt like a second loss layered on top of the first. He understood that was not how Cutter would have seen it. Cutter would have said something precise and unsentimental about the function of wounds and the difference between honoring a person and using the fact of their absence as an anchor you drag behind you. He would have said it without ceremony in the tone of a man stating something obvious, who was aware that obvious things sometimes needed to be stated. Dax set the phone face up on the table. He thought about what he was going to say in that room and how he was going to say it, which was not rehearsal, because he did not rehearse, but the particular kind of readiness that came from having done the work of understanding something completely enough that saying it was not separate from knowing it. He was going to say what was true. He was going to say it in the order it was true, and with the precision that the truth deserved. and without asking the room to give him anything he had not earned from the evidence he was bringing into it. That was all. The sky began to lighten at 5:40. He made coffee and drank it at the window and watched the desert come back into visibility the way it did each morning, the ridgelines resolving out of the dark, one shade at a time. It was a cold morning. He could see his breath against the glass. He thought about Nora Kirsch and whether she was awake right now, and what the morning looked like from wherever she was, and whether she was thinking about the hearing. He thought she probably was. He got dressed and checked the bike and left for the municipal building at 7:40, which gave him more than enough time and which was intentional, because he did not like arriving at places without the margin to read the room before the room started. The departmental review board convened in a third-floor room that was not large. 5 people behind the long table. The lieutenant from the night on the road who gave Dax a brief nod when he came in that was professional rather than personal, but was not nothing. A woman named Reyes who ran the proceeding with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times and had made peace with its pace. A civilian oversight representative from the county. 2 others whose affiliations were stated at the opening and who asked precise questions throughout. Pruitt was at the side table when Dax arrived. He was with an attorney who had the competence of someone called in quickly. Pruitt did not look at Dax when Dax came in. This was information of a kind. Dax sat in the chair before the long table, set his folder on the floor beside the chair, and waited for Reyes to start. She stated the purpose and the format. Administrative review, not criminal proceeding. The board would establish a factual record. Findings would be issued within 5 business days. All parties had received relevant materials in advance. She asked Dax to state his name and connection to the events under review. He gave his name. He said he had been present at mile marker 214 on State Route 67 on the night of October 14th, had provided emergency care to Officer Nora Kirsch, had subsequently provided video evidence to Captain Brennan, and had cooperated with the district attorney's investigative inquiry. She asked him to walk the board through the events beginning from his first observation of the situation at mile marker 214. He did. He used the words he had used in his written account because those words were accurate, and he had already done the work of finding accurate words. He described the guardrail damage visible in his headlight. He described coming down the embankment. He described finding Nora Kirsch and what he had assessed, and why he had made the decisions he made. He described what the paramedic had said when the paramedic arrived. He was precise about what he had directly observed, and careful to distinguish it from what he had inferred. And he said clearly when something was an assessment rather than a fact. This distinction was one that most people did not make consistently, and its absence was most of where testimony collapsed under questioning. He made it consistently. The board asked questions. He answered them. He gave the same answers he had given the 4 previous times he had been asked, because the answers had not changed, because the events had not changed, and the consistency across 4 separate interviews spanning 10 days was itself a kind of evidence that he noted without calling attention to it, trusting the board to notice it themselves. Then Pruitt's attorney was given the floor. The attorney was smooth. He had the intelligence to use what he had been given carefully, and the professionalism to avoid overreaching into territory that would only expose the limits of his position. He asked about the civil litigation matter. He asked about the Hells Angels affiliation and its implications for credibility. He asked about Dax's medical qualifications. Dax answered each question with the same directness he brought to everything. On the civil matter, he said it had been settled without admission, and he was happy to discuss the specifics if the board wished, but observed that the reason for its introduction into these proceedings was itself worth the board's consideration. On the affiliation, he said, his affiliation was what it was, and that the board would make its own determination of its relevance to his credibility, and that he would suggest the most productive basis for that determination was the consistency of his account across 4 separate interviews over 10 days, the corroboration of the physical facts by camera footage, and the condition of the officer whose care the account described. On the medical qualifications, he said he did not hold a certificate, and that the board could assess the quality of the outcome for themselves. The attorney continued for another 10 minutes, covering variations of the same territory from different angles. Dax answered each one in the same register level and direct, without retreat, and without escalation, without asking the room for anything except that it look at what was on the table. The attorney said he had no further questions. Reyes asked Dax if he had materials he wished to present to the board. He picked up the folder from beside the chair. He said he had 3 documents he would like entered into the record. He said they were copies of incident reports filed with the Black Ridge Police Department over the 8 months preceding October 14th, each concerning a subject named Vic Sadler, who was currently in custody in Harmon County in connection with the attack on Officer Kirsch. He said each report bore the intake confirmation signature of the detective under review. He said none of the 3 reports had resulted in an investigation being opened. He stood and placed the folder on the long table. He stood at the front of the room and he looked at the 5 people behind the table. And he said he had one question for the board. He asked whether if any of the 3 reports had resulted in an investigation being opened, Officer Nora Kirsch would have been alone on State Route 67 on the night of October 14th. He sat back down. The room was quiet, not the quiet of a room waiting for someone to speak. The quiet of a room where something had landed and was settling into the space and displacing the previous atmosphere, the way a stone displaced water. The effect spreading outward from the point of impact in concentric rings that reached the walls and came back, and the surface did not stop moving for some time. Reyes was reading the first document in the folder with the focused attention of a person who wanted to know what the document actually said, rather than what she had been told it said. She turned to the second page. She set it aside and picked up the second document and read it with the same attention. Pruitt's attorney was speaking to Pruitt in a low voice. Dax did not watch them. He watched Reyes and the way the other board members were receiving the material, the quality of their attention, the specific quality of people who had been prepared for a meeting and had just been given something that was not on the preparation. Reyes set the third document down and looked at the attorney. She asked if his client wished to respond to the submitted materials. The attorney said they would need time to review the documents. Reyes observed that all relevant materials had been provided to both parties in advance of the proceeding and asked whether the documents submitted were materials of which the detective had been unaware prior to this morning. The attorney said he needed to confer with his client. Reyes said he had 3 minutes. The 3 minutes were not silent. The room had its ambient sounds. The ventilation, the distant traffic from the street below. The sound of people in the proceeding managing the awareness that something had shifted in the room and that the shift was irreversible. You could not unknow something once it had been stated plainly in a formal record with signatures attached. Dax looked at the window on the far wall. The window showed the parking structure across the street, and above it the October sky, the same clear, cold blue it had been all week. He looked at it without thinking specifically about anything, the way you sometimes looked at a fixed point when you needed your mind to have somewhere to rest while the situation continued developing around you. He thought about Cutter, not the message, not the accounting of what could and could not have been different. Just Cutter as a presence, the specific warmth of 19 years of a person being in your life in the way that people were when they were genuinely known to you, and genuinely knowing. The texture of that, the weight of its absence, and the way the absence was different now than it had been 2 weeks ago. Not smaller, but differently shaped, the way a wound changed shape as it healed, without becoming something other than what it was. He thought Cutter would have found the specific irony of this room legible, and would have had something economical and correct to say about it, in the flat tone he used for things he had decided were true and was not interested in arguing about. The 3 minutes passed. The attorney said his client maintained that the routing and disposition of the reports in question had been consistent with departmental protocols for intake prioritization, and that there was no foundation for any suggestion of improper conduct. He said it in the professional voice of an attorney stating a position he was paid to state, and the professional voice carried its own information, the specific quality of a statement made in obligation rather than conviction. Reyes looked at him. She set the last document she had been holding down on the table with a precision that was not dramatic, but was deliberate, the way you set something down when you wanted the setting down to be visible. She looked at the other board members. What passed between them was not speech, but was communication, the kind that happened in rooms where people had been working together long enough to understand each other's silences. She said the board would take a brief recess. The board stood and filed out through the back door. Dax stood when the board stood and remained standing. He went to the window because there was space there, and the window had the sky in it. He became aware after a moment that the main door had opened behind him. He turned. Nora Kirsch was standing near the back of the room. She was not in uniform. Civilian clothes, a jacket, her movement carrying the careful quality of someone operating within limits that had been recently defined and was pressing against them as much as the honoring permitted. She was pale in the way that significant blood loss left its signature in a person for weeks afterward. But her eyes were clear, and her posture was the posture of a person who had decided to be upright and was committed to that decision, with everything she currently had to commit with. She had not come to testify. She had come because the thing in this room was something that mattered, and she needed to be near the place where it was being decided, because proximity itself was a kind of presence, and presence was a kind of testimony, even when it was not formal and was not on the record. Dax looked at her from across the room. She looked back. He gave her a nod. She gave one back. Pruitt saw her. Dax watched Pruitt see her watch the quality of the detective's stillness change in the specific way it changed when a person encountered something that revised their calculation. Pruitt looked at her for a moment, and then looked at his attorney, and then looked at the table. He did not look at her again. The board returned 9 minutes after they had left. Reyes sat and organized the documents in front of her with the efficiency of a person who had arrived at a decision and was preparing to state it in the form the record required. She said the board had reviewed the submitted materials and found them sufficient to warrant formal escalation of the review to the County Oversight Authority. She said that pending the outcome of that escalation, Detective Cal Pruitt was placed on indefinite administrative suspension, that his access to all departmental systems and facilities was suspended effective immediately, and that the 3 incident reports submitted by Dax Harlow were entered into the formal record and would be transmitted to the district attorney's office as relevant to the ongoing criminal investigation into the attack on Officer Kirsch. She paused. She said one additional thing. She said it in the same flat administrative register she had used for everything without elevation or editorial, in the specific voice of someone stating for the record what the record required to be complete. She said that the evidence which had most directly advanced the board's understanding of the relevant facts had been provided by a private civilian with no official role in the investigation. She stated his name. She stated his affiliation because the record required it. She said the board wished to note for the same record that the actions taken by this individual on the night of October 14th and in the 10 days following had been consequential, both to the preservation of a sworn officer's life and to the integrity of the current proceedings. The gavel came down, once, without drama, with the finality of a thing being concluded. Pruitt's attorney was already oriented toward his client before the sound of it had fully dissolved. Dax picked up his folder from beside the chair and walked toward the back of the room. Nora Kirsch was still there. She had heard all of it. She had heard his name said in the statement Reyes had made, and she had heard the word affiliation said in it. And she had heard the board's notation that both of those things and the events of October 14th were now part of the same sentence in the same permanent record. He stopped a few feet from her. She said she had listened to the recording of his 911 call. He waited. She said they kept recordings for quality and training purposes and that she had asked to hear it when she was well enough to understand what she was hearing. She said he had given the location and described the situation. And then, before anything else, before they had asked for status, he had said one thing first. She said, "You said she's alive." She said it the way you said something that had mattered to you, and that you had been carrying and wanted to put down somewhere specific and true. She said, not, "I found an officer," not, "There's an injured cop on the road." She's alive. That was the first thing. He looked at her. He thought about the gravel and the pulse that had been present and fast and working harder than it should have had to work. He thought about the specific weight of the word alive, when alive was the thing that was still true but was not going to be true indefinitely without intervention. He said it seemed like the right thing to lead with. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know who you are. I looked you up when they told me your name." She said it without apology, the way someone said a factual thing that needed to be acknowledged before what came next could be said honestly. "I know what the patch means to a lot of people." He said nothing. She said, "I also know what 12 minutes on the ground in October means." He said you were alone on a bad road. He said it without inflection, the way he said things that were simply true and did not require anything added to them. Someone needed to not drive past. She looked at him for a moment. Then she extended her hand. He shook it with the care that the situation warranted, aware of what she was still recovering from, and aware that she was choosing to be standing in this room, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm glad you're standing up." It was the most precise thing he could say, and he said it without addition. And she received it in the same register, two people standing in a hallway outside a room where something had just been settled. In the ordinary and unremarkable aftermath of it, he went down the stairs and through the main doors and into the October morning. He parked in the garage and sat on the bike in the quiet. After the motor stopped looking at the workbench, at the tools on the wall in their places, at the customer's bike, on the stand that was finished and waiting for pickup. He went inside. He put on his jacket again and went back to the garage. He checked the bike and pulled it out and started it and let it warm up at idle while he stood beside it in the cold October air. He rode west. State Route 67 opened up once he crossed the county line, the same 40 miles of high desert he had been riding for 23 years. He rode at the pace of the conditions, which were good clear sky and dry road, and a headwind from the northwest that was present, but not insistent. He slowed at mile marker 213. The temporary orange barrier was still in place where the damaged section of rail had been. Bright against the gray of the desert scrub, the kind of visibility that said, "Look at this, something needs attention here." The yellow evidence tape from the initial investigation had mostly come down in the wind of the intervening week. He pulled to the shoulder at 214 and stopped. He killed the engine. The silence came in the way it always came when the motor stopped, the sudden awareness of everything that had been underneath the sound, while the sound was present. Wind. The creak of the temporary barrier in the light gust. The ambient presence of the desert in the middle of the day, which was a kind of silence that was actually made of many sounds. The movement of air through dry vegetation, and the distant call of a bird, and the small sounds of the road surface responding to temperature in the way that surfaces did. He got off the bike. He stood on the shoulder with the orange barrier to his left and looked at the gap. The barrier was closing the gap that had been open on the night he had come around the last bend from the east at 11:30 in the rain. He tried to reconstruct the specific visual conditions of that moment. The headlight reaching forward, the rain reducing the range, the specific angle at which the damaged rail had been visible, the 2-second window, the way he had already begun to lean back into the road before something had made him straighten. He stood with all of that and did not try to make it into anything more than what it was. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the phone and looked at the screen and unlocked it and navigated to the message thread. He read the last message. Heading home. Road's bad tonight. He had read these words in grief and in guilt, and in the specific accounting that grief and guilt required when they were being honest. He had read them in the middle of the night at the kitchen table and on the shoulder of county roads and in the quiet of the garage. He had read them in the hearing room in his mind while Reyes was stating findings and his name was being said in connection with the affiliation and what he had done. He read them now, standing at mile marker 214. He understood that Cutter had been heading home. That was what the message said. A man heading home on a bad road doing what he did, keeping the people who mattered to him informed of where he was because that was a form of saying they mattered. He had been the person he always was, right up to the last moment of being that person. And the last moment had arrived without announcement, the way last moments always did. There was nothing in the 6 words that was a wound. The wound was in the silence after them, the silence of the road, and the 2 hours, and the man in the pickup truck who had arrived too late because the angle of his headlights happened to be wrong until they happened to be right. He looked at the words one last time. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket. He stood at mile marker 214 for another minute. Not thinking, not accounting, not in conversation with anything except the present tense of standing where he was, on a cold October afternoon with the desert around him, doing what the desert did. Then he put on his helmet and got back on the bike. He started the engine. He pulled out heading east. He rode the 11 miles back at the pace the road asked for. The bike tracked true. The headwind was with him now, coming from the right, and he leaned into it the way he had been leaning into wind on this road for 23 years without thought. The adjustment purely physical, purely the accumulated knowledge of the body doing what it had learned to do. He turned off the highway onto the county road. He pulled into the garage. He sat on the bike after the engine stopped and looked at the workbench. He thought about Cutter one more time, not with the weight of the past 2 weeks, but with the simple presence of a person thought about the way you thought about someone who had been real and was still real in the ways that people remained real after they were gone. He thought about the specific sound of Cutter's laugh, and the specific way Cutter held a cup of coffee, and the specific way he had of making a point without appearing to be making a point, the economy of it. He thought about what Cutter had said about the things that accumulated, the things done in the dark when nobody was counting. He thought about the sentence in the record with his name in it, and the affiliation and what he had done the sentence that had been read into the formal proceedings of the county by a woman who had stated it because the record required it. And he thought about how that sentence would not exist, except for a man deciding not to drive past a damaged guardrail on a bad road at 11:30 on a Sunday night. Sometimes the things done in the dark ended up in the light. That was not the reason you did them. The reason you did them was that they needed doing and you were there. But sometimes the accounting that followed was visible, and the visibility mattered even when it was not the point, because the record was one of the ways the world had of holding on to the true things. He got off the bike. He went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and drank it, and looked at the garage through the glass at the bike visible through the open door. Ordinary in the ordinary afternoon light. Specific in his. He set the cup in the rack. He went back to the garage and put on his work gloves and bent over the valve adjustment he had set aside 2 days ago, and found the place in the work where the hands knew what they were doing, and the mind could settle into the quiet that came after the thing that had needed to be done was done. Outside the garage, the October afternoon continued at its own pace. The sky held its blue. The wind came off the mesa and moved through the scrub and moved on. 11 miles west on State Route 67, the orange barrier stood in the gap at mile marker 214, temporary and bright visible from a distance, doing what barriers were supposed to do until the permanent repair could be made. In the county files and the department files and the offices of the district attorney, the record existed. It said what it said. The record said a private civilian had provided the evidence that mattered most. The record said his name. The record said his affiliation. The record put all three things in the same sentence, and the sentence was true and would remain true. And that was what records were for. He worked until the light through the garage door told him the afternoon had used itself up, and the early dark of late October was coming in from the east. He cleaned the tools and put them in their places and turned off the light, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the garage, looking at the darkening property and the sky above the ridgeline to the east, which was doing what the sky did in the last minutes. Before full dark, the colors coming out of it in the reverse order. They had come into it in the morning, the blue deepening and the horizon holding a line of light that diminished as he watched, and then was gone. He went inside. The phone was on the kitchen table where he had left it when he came back from the road face up. He looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Then he went to the window and looked at the dark outside, which was the regular dark of a clear October night in the high desert full of stars, and without weather and indifferent to everything happening at its edge, in the way that the natural world was indifferent to the specific concerns of the people moving through it. He thought about the road. Not in grief and not in accounting, just the road the way it was stretching in both directions from any given point, on it carrying whoever happened to be on it toward wherever they were going through whatever conditions the night happened to be offering. He thought about what it meant to be someone who stopped. The direction was you stopped because the stopping mattered and you were there, and therefore you were the one who stopped. Not because of who you were before the stopping or what patch you wore or what files existed with your name on them. Because you were there, and the stopping mattered. And the two things came together in a moment that did not announce itself in advance. That was what accumulated. That was what Cutter had been talking about. He understood it now. He left the phone on the table and went to bed, and the October night continued outside the window in the way it had been continuing, vast and cold and full of stars. The desert doing what the desert did in the hours between dark and light, which was to say it endured, which was the thing it had always done and would continue doing long after all the particular concerns of any given Tuesday had been settled or left unsettled, and the people who had carried them had moved on.